So today's open classroom is a part of our Black History Month series. So it's a time in which we honor and commemorate our African American ancestors, contemporaries, and next generation, as well as co-conspirators who have gone above and beyond in every aspect of the preservation, expression, and appreciation of Black labor, creativity, strength, and innovation. This year's theme is Strength in Labor, the legacy and future of African American contributions. And I would like to acknowledge and thank the entire Black History Month Planning Committee, especially co-chairs Amber Brown and Cynthia Williams, who not only helped to put together this lineup of speakers, but also to build our celebratory and informative Black History Month website, which I hope you all take some time to check out. So the link will be on the screen in the chat. And before I want to introduce today's speaker, I do want to acknowledge that the land and the labor in which we find ourselves today. So as we celebrate 100 years of education, service, and community impact spanning local, national, and international spheres, the Brown School honors the land we gather on and the labor of Indigenous, Black, immigrant, American-born, and other marginalized communities whose contributions have profoundly shaped St. Louis and our institutions. We recognize the injustices endured and the sacrifices and contributions of these communities whose exploited labor and unwavering resilience have strengthened the university and the broader region. This acknowledgement reflects our steadfast commitment to equity, justice, and community partnership as we look to the future. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce today our speaker. Dr. Sheretta Butler-Barnes is a developmental psychologist. Oh, looks like I'm having some video artifacts. Sorry about that. And Dr. Sheretta Butler-Barnes is a developmental psychologist and has expertise in scholarly work on the impact of racism and the use of culturally strength-based assets on the health and well-being outcomes of Black American families. She's a professor at the WashU Brown School of Social Work with affiliations in African and African American Studies and the Division of Data and Computational Sciences. During the 2023 and 2024 school year, she was the inaugural Sojourner Truth Visiting Professor of Racial and Social Justice at Rutgers University School of Social Work. Butler-Barnes received her PhD and MA from Wayne State University in Psychology and a BS in Psychology from Michigan State University. The two lines of her research agenda include Black Families and Racial Justice Project, which is a mixed methodological investigation of Black families' vulnerability to or resilience against marginalization, focusing on parenting practices and adolescent development trajectories, and two, Equity for Black Women and Girls Project, which focuses on advancing equity for women and girls of color by identifying risk and protective factors in learning spaces and creating culturally responsive programming that promotes resiliency. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Butler-Barnes.
Thank you. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. And so, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I am going to start sharing my screen. Thank you so much for being here. You could be anywhere today, but you all are here with me. And I am excited to talk to you all about some of the work that I've been engaging in and ways in which we can support Black families, especially in this socio-political climate. And so the title of this talk today is The Power of Knowing, Racial Identity as a Shield Against Racism and Parental Stress. Again, I am Sheretta Butler-Barnes. And so I'm going to talk today about vicarious racism, racial trauma, and the importance of racial identity. That will be the literature review. I'm then going to have discussions about the guiding framework and ways in which we can understand Black family stress by using theories and models that are applicable to the lived experiences of Black folks. I'm going to present some of my research findings, and this was during the time that I was on sabbatical at Rutgers University as the Sojourner Truth professor, visiting professor. And then I'm going to present ways in which we can support Black families by using culturally centered, culturally responsive sort of racial identity techniques as well. So before we get started, if you know me, I am almost always wanting to make sure that we have the similar knowledge of terms. And in this presentation, I want to make sure that we understand the different forms of racism. And so oftentimes when we speak about racism, persons might identify sort of one specific sort of source of racism and believe that by addressing that one source of racism that we can sort of address all other sorts of racism. But that's not necessarily the case because these different forms of racism often intersect and reinforce each other. And so, first, let me talk about individual and interpersonal racism, what that is. And so, that is personal level prejudice, bias, and discrimination between individuals, and it includes both explicit and implicit biases that manifest in personal interactions. And then we have institutional racism, where there are discriminatory policies and practices within organizations and institutions that routinely produce inequitable outcomes for racial groups, regardless of the individual intent. And then one of the forms of racism we typically talk about is structural and systemic racism. This is the overarching system of racial bias across institutions and society, including historical, cultural, and social dynamics that perpetuate racial group inequity. And then you have cultural racism, where the cultural images and messages that affirm the assumed superiority of whites and the assumed inferiority of people of color, this sort of manifests itself through media, education, and cultural narratives. Okay. And so you typically see these sort of forms of cultural racism through, again, social media, education, and cultural narratives. Now, the focus in this presentation that I'm going to talk about later, and this is why I have it in red, is vicarious racism. And so this is the indirect experiences of racism through observation, seeing it, but you may not experience it directly. So it's very different than interpersonal racism, storytelling, or witnessing discrimination against other members of one's racial group. And this can lead to similar psychological and physiological stress responses as direct experiences, right? And so you may not experience it at the individual, interpersonal, daily experience level, but it still has the significant impact, vicarious racism. And so these forms of racism often interact and reinforce each other, creating a cumulative impact on individuals and communities of color. And so, what are some examples? So, individual interpersonal racism, a store employee following Black customers around the store due to racial prejudice. Institutional racism, mortgage lending practices that disproportionately deny loans to qualified Black applicants. Then we have structural systemic racism, where the combined effect of housing discrimination, school funding based on property taxes, that results in educational disparities that we see today. Cultural racism, media portrayals that consistently depict certain groups, certain racial groups in stereotypical or negative roles. Okay, and then we have vicarious racism, again, which is the focus of this presentation, where perhaps parents experiencing stress and trauma from watching news coverage of racial violence against people of their race also impacts them. And so I wanted to present these sort of different forms of racism as we go through so that you all have a clear, so we have the similar knowledge in terms of the different forms of racism, but also in this presentation that I'm just going to be centering vicarious racism, which is very different than the others. And so what is vicarious racism? I presented an example of that, but it really does occur and have detrimental consequences for persons. And it occurs when individuals experience racial trauma through witnessing or hearing about a racist incident that happened to others. So this can be through various forms of social media. It can be when we watch the news, it could be on TikTok, it could be on Instagram, it could be on Facebook. It can be on X. We can even hear about it from others. We can witness it in a parking lot. And so it's interesting because we don't necessarily focus a lot on vicarious racism, but it does have detrimental effects like increased anxiety and depression, heightened racial vigilance, where a person feels as if when they go into spaces, if their race is very salient, then if it's a space that they don't deem to feel safe in, then they might be hyper vigilant, which also is associated with higher levels of physiological stress. And then you also have secondary traumatic stress. So again, you don't have to experience it personally. It's very different than interpersonal, but you still can experience some form of secondary traumatic stress. And I think about this with the George Floyd incident as, We saw it through social media, but there were several Black Americans who I've had conversations with through my line of research who stated that they just could not watch it because it made them stressed. They were very upset, and they reported sort of this heightened racial vigilance in watching that incident unfold. And so, in further understanding vicarious racism, we know that it has an impact on mental health that I've just stated, but also there are intergenerational effects of this. And so, parents' own experiences of racism can affect their children's well being and their racial identity development in some ways that if parents cannot contend with their own sort of racial stressors, if they're experiencing high levels of stress, and we just talked about the different forms of racism. That is just not one, but they often intersect, then that will impact the communication messages that they're having with their children. And these are some of the findings that I found in some of my earlier work. But also, one of the protective mechanisms that I'm going to talk about in this presentation is the protective role of racial identity. And so strong racial identity and family communication about what's going on in today's society, particularly within this socio-political climate, can serve as buffers against the negative effects of vicarious racism. And so, why is it important to examine vicarious racism? Well, it's important to public health for a couple of reasons. Again, we tend to sort of center on specific types of racism without understanding that there are different forms. But also, the research shows that vicarious racism experiences significantly impact mental and physical health outcomes across populations, which makes it a crucial public health concern. It's also important for intervention development because we can further understand um, vicarious racism as essential for developing effective interventions and support systems for those families who are more likely to be impacted by this. And so, again, when I think of sort of this secondary experiences of racism, I think about these Karen incidents that we tend to see in the media, where we're watching these things, where we are experiencing these things happen, and where we're interacting to them, having this sort of visceral response to this. And also, the intergenerational effect is particularly important now, especially in a socio-political climate where it is purported that we're in a post-racial America, and we are not. Okay, we are hearing storytelling is very important. We are observing and we're also learning. And so, this idea of this intergenerational trauma transmission, it does indeed affect family dynamics and child development. And so, from vicarious racism to racial trauma, how can I make this connection? And why did I make this connection? Well, it's important to understand the relationship between vicarious racism and racial trauma because it's crucial to comprehend the full scopes of racism's impact on mental health and well-being of Black Americans. For one, we know that studies show that indirect exposure is associated with mental and physical health outcomes. We know that there is a psychological impact because the repeated exposure leads to heightened stress responses, anxiety, and psychological distress, which can also lead to one ruminating, um, which can be associated with difficulty of sleep, social anxiety, not wanting to go in certain places, and really having a view that persons from your that are non-Black can have a negative view of you, which also leads to higher levels of stress. And we know that it's a cumulative effect as well over time. And then racial trauma suggests that the accumulation of these experiences manifests itself as racial trauma and it impacts one's individual and their collective well being. And so this progression helps us explain how everyday experiences of vicarious racism contribute to the broader phenomenon of racial trauma, which has significant implications for mental health outcomes and parental stress. And so when I think about racial trauma as parental stress, I'm thinking about it in a couple of ways. Number one, building on the current research literature, the direct and vicarious experiences of racism that Black families often have to contend with. And then again, I'm emphasizing this physiological and the psychological impact in terms of how racial trauma can be a form of parental stress. And I'm thinking about the intergenerational effects of these things, the storytelling, and why these things are important, and the additional parenting burden of raising a child in this society where you are trying to have them develop a healthy identity, but it's also a healthy racial identity when the world is telling you that you are not worthy, when the world is telling you that you are inferior, where parents have to sort of contend with their own stressors and raise a child and preparing them for racial bias. These sorts of experiences can create unique parental stress. And so this is why I am situating racial trauma as parental stress. And so, what are the research gaps in vicarious racism and racial trauma? And why did I want to share this with you all today? And so, number one, there are methodological gaps. There's a limited longitudinal studies tracking long-term effects of vicarious racism, because this is a form of racism that we tend not to focus on. There are insufficient measurement tools for vicarious racism, and we need for more diverse population sampling. What this means is that we need to be asking youth about their vicarious experiences, children um, about their vicarious experiences. We need to be asking emerging adults and sort of older Americans. So we really do need to take a developmental lifespan approach when we're trying to understand how this form of racism, vicarious racism, impacts people of color. There are also conceptual gaps, right? So there are unclear mechanisms linking vicarious exposure to health outcomes. We have a limited understanding of what protective processes may look like, and there's an inadequate framework for intersectional experiences. And what I mean by this is, how do we consider vicarious racism as a form of stress for African Americans who hold multiple social identities, right? And so we're talking about our LGBTQIA plus Black Americans. And so we're talking about those who are, have varying gender identities, religious identities, along with their racial identity. How are the ways we can study vicarious racism, and how does it show up in this population? And then also, there are clinical gaps. There are a few evidence-based interventions specifically for vicarious racism. There's limited research on treatment effectiveness, and there is a need for culturally informed clinical approaches. And so these gaps highlight the need for a more comprehensive research approaches and improved theoretical frameworks to better understand and address the vicarious racism's impact. And so now we get to racial identity. This is a foundational framework for examining protective processes against racism and parental stress. And so when I talk about racial identity, I use the multidimensional inventory of Black identity framework. And this is a validated tool that assesses three dimensions of racial identity in African American adults. And let me just say here, um, for decades, racial identity has been a protective factor for African Americans who have experienced direct forms of racism, because it centers on racial centrality being one. So, this is the extent to which race is a core part of an individual's self concept and identity. That means when I go into spaces, one's race may be more salient than others, right? And so, if I am in a predominantly white space, my being a person of color, a Black woman, becomes very central in that space. It becomes salient in that space, right? And then you have racial regard. And these are our private feelings about being Black. And this is racial pride. So I'm proud of the accomplishments of African Americans. I feel good to be Black, and I am proud to be Black. And then we have the perceptions of others. And so this is the public view. And this is pretty much, how do other persons view my racial group? And so all of these things sort of center around identity. And then you get at racial ideology, which is one's belief, opinions, and attitudes about how African Americans should act and interact with society. So in this ideological subscale, it asks questions such as, African Americans who hold a colorblind ideology, who align with a more humanist stance. This ideology also gets at the way in which, if African Americans feel like in order to get ahead, they have to assimilate to white culture and or to whiteness. And then it also gets at nationalists, the ways in which Black folks may feel the need and the necessity to support Black businesses, to send their children to HBCUs, to show and expose their children to Black art. All of these things have been associated with higher well-being outcomes, and these things have also been associated with mental health as well too. And so the way that I'm looking at this framework, the MIBI provides crucial insights into how individuals understand and experience their racial identity, which can influence responses to both direct and vicarious racism. And so, for the purposes of this study, as I'm going to go further, I am focusing on the first two dimensions: racial centrality, the extent to how race is salient in spaces where we are experiencing racism, and also racial regard, the extent to which I am proud and have racial pride in terms of we're proud to be Black Americans, and also views of other groups in society in terms of what they think about us. And so research on racial identity, I've spoke about some of this. There's an association with racial pride, private regard, and psychological well-being. Research by Bynum and her colleagues found that higher private regard scores were associated with lower depression symptoms and better psychological adjustment among African American college students. So students with positive feelings about their racial identity showed a greater resilience against race-related stress. And then we move to public health and mental health outcomes. So a longitudinal study a longitudinal study by Sellers demonstrated that lower public regard beliefs predicted increased vulnerability to racial discrimination and higher anxiety levels among African Americans. And so this idea that if I believe that others view my group in a negative way, then this is leading to higher anxiety levels about showing up in spaces, and you have a vulnerability to racial discrimination if you believe the outgroup members, view your group in a very negative way. And then we get to racial centrality and health behaviors. Research conducted by Davis revealed that higher racial centrality was associated with increased health protective behaviors and better physical health outcomes among African American adults. And so participants with high centrality were more likely to engage in preventative health care and maintain healthy lifestyle practices. So what does that mean? African Americans who felt like their race was salient to them. It was an important part of who they are. It was an important part of their identity. They were more likely to engage in preventative health care. And so having a healthy racial identity matters when one encounters racial stressors within the community. And so racial identity as a protective factor, we know that it's protective factor for psychological well-being, for physical health outcomes, and it's a coping mechanism. And also, there is research that demonstrates the long-term resilience to race-related stressors and one's exposure to racial discrimination. And so multiple studies consistently show that a strong, healthy, positive identity serves as a crucial protective mechanism, buffering individuals against the negative psychological and physiological effects of racial discrimination, while also promoting resilience and adaptive coping strategies. So again, I want to underscore the important role for racial identity as a protective factor in psychological well-being. We know that it's a coping mechanism. It has implications for physical health outcomes, and there's research that documents the long-term protective effect of racial identity. And so now I want to get to a theoretical model that I tend to use, and actually, it's one that I develop with other scholars that are interested in this scholarship. And this is Murray's model of Black family stress. And so this model is a comprehensive model for understanding stress and resilience in Black American families. And it is expanding traditional family stress theories to incorporate cultural and contextual factors. And the importance of this model and why we wanted to use this model was for a couple of reasons. Number one, it honors the history of Black folks, it honors and acknowledges the past. This model deviates from having a revisionist history. So we start at the very onset of acknowledging that in order to understand Black people, that you must take account of the historical vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow laws that have impacted Black Americans in today's society. And so, also as a result of that, there are everyday stressors that Black Americans have to contend with. And this leads to some social challenges and some economic challenges as well. But also, coping is particularly important in our model as we talk about strategies that African American families tend to use. We know that these are things that we term ordinary magic, sort of this important role of racial socialization and ethnic identity, and then the important role of family processes. And so, the way that I'm using this model is really trying to understand how do we navigate parental stress through racial identity. And so I know that positive racial identity can serve as a powerful resource for Black American parents as they navigate the challenges of parenting and racial socialization. Strong racial identity helps parents build resiliency and develop effective coping strategies for managing stress while raising their children in this socio-political climate. And again, research shows that um, racial socialization is particularly important. Racial identity helps parents communicate these messages. It helps them cope with race related stressors, and it also helps them maintain a healthy psychological well being. And so, in using Murray's model, I am able to situate Black families within the current social political context, but also acknowledging racial trauma, vicarious racism, but also holding on to that cultural resiliency piece that I think is really important for Black Americans, and that is racial identity. And so, for the current study, this is the conceptual model that I am going to be studying. So, vicarious racism and the impact on racial trauma, but I'm also looking at the protective role of racial identity beliefs. And so let's talk about recruitment for this study. And so this data collection occurred last year when I was visiting professor at Rutgers University. And so data was collected in New Jersey among urban and suburban communities throughout various educational institutions and in New York and metropolitan areas and surrounding suburbs. The recruitment methods, we reached out to local organizations. There were social media advertisements. We went through the Divine Nine, and we also used a snowball techniques in terms of word of mouth networking. The eligibility criteria for Black Americans to participate, parents, number one, they had to be a parent over the age of 18, and they had to have a children between the ages of 5 and 10 years old, and they had to self-identify as African American. And data collection occurred over I have here 18 months. And I'm clearly recognizing that that's a typo because we collected data from February to June. So I apologize for that typo. But what I did want to state about why this is particularly important is that this is part of a larger study that the reason why we chose children of parents of children between the ages of 5 and 10 years old is that we were examining Black parents' views about book banning and removal of books within the classroom and removal of curriculum that sort of centered on race and or LGBTQIA plus content. And so this data is from that larger study. And so we talked about our recruitment efforts a bit, but to go a little bit further, again, school districts, we went through Peach Star, we went through family agencies and organizations, we went through National Pan-Hale organizations, the Rutgers University's campus community, and again, the snowballing technique. And so this multifaceted approach allowed us to access diverse segments of the Black community, and we wanted to ensure broad representation across socioeconomic backgrounds, education levels, and geographic locations. And as you can see here, this is the flyer that was advertised during that time. And so, our methods, what did we end up getting? And so, our study definitely includes a diverse sample of Black parents from urban and suburban communities across the Northeastern United States. They are from, again, it's a cross section of of varied socioeconomic backgrounds, education levels, and family structures. But the total sample size, we have 600 parents that participated in the study. They their average age is 35 years of age, ranging between 25 and 55 years old. Their educational background, majority had attended some college, with their educational levels ranging from high school diploma to advanced degrees. Their average income fell between $50,000 and $75,000 a year. And a gender distribution, we have more fathers that participated in this study, but we did want to ensure a balanced representation of parental perspectives. Participants were given a $20 incentive, and data collection was collected both in person and through secure online platforms, and everybody consented to participate in this study. And so I was very lucky to get 600 parents at this time. And again, they were interested in sharing their experiences around race, racism, and book banning as well too. And so for the current study, let's talk about some of the measures and some of the findings that I'm now going to present to you all. So some of the demographics that we controlled for was age, parents' gender, and their education level. But the scale that we used was vicarious racism stress. The vicarious racism stress scale assessed distress in response to indirect exposure to racism. And so 4 items were used. And it started off with like how distressed or bothered do you get by the following situations: hearing people being the victims of racism in the news, hearing about family members or friends who experience racism, seeing other people in public being treated unfairly because of their race, and seeing racism depicted in movies and or television shows. And with the racial identity, again, we use 3 subscales. We use the MIBI. And the MIBI I discussed earlier with you all. We looked at centrality. A sample question is, in general, being Black is an important part of my self-image. Private regard, racial pride scale. I feel that Blacks have made major accomplishments and advancements in today's society. Public regard, overall, Blacks are considered good by others. And then we go to our racial trauma scale, where the trauma symptoms of discrimination scale was used to assess caregivers' psychological and their emotional distress reactions to racism. And this scale is comprised of 22 items. Sample item: due to past experiences of discrimination, I often cannot stop or control my worrying. So these are some of our findings. As you all can see here, we had significant findings throughout this model. I ran a hierarchical regression model where we examined vicarious racism, racial identity, and racial trauma. And what I want you all to pay attention to is step 4. This is the last step. But what we have here is that vicarious racism was associated with higher levels of racial trauma. And so Black parents who reported these higher levels were more likely to report racial trauma. However, Black parents who reported higher levels of private regard, this means that they are proud of the accomplishments of African Americans. They have higher levels of racial pride. They tended to report lower levels of racial trauma. And what's interesting here is public regard. And so I'm going to talk about this finding a little bit later, because this actually is the opposite of what I hypothesize. And so public regard, so the more African Americans view others as viewing them positively, they have higher levels of racial trauma. But you would think that if they viewed, or if they felt that other members in the outgroup viewed them in a more positive way, that they would have lower levels of racial trauma. But we did not find that. So again, if African Americans felt like society viewed them as good Black folk, then they experience higher levels of racial trauma. But we're going to unpack that when we when we get to the conclusion section, when we have the discussion. And so with centrality, African Americans who felt like their race was a central part of who they were, they reported lower levels of racial trauma. And so what we see here, you all, private regard, being prideful of being African American, and also if my race is central to my identity, parents are reporting lower levels of racial trauma. as opposed to Black parents who believe that society views them as good. They have higher levels of racial trauma. And so let's talk about this through our two interaction effects in terms of what we see. And so, what do we see here? As vicarious racism increases, racial trauma also increases for both low public regard and high public regard. And so, what do we see here? Persons with low public regard experience less racial trauma at both levels of vicarious racism. And so, individuals with high public regard right here experience sort of greater less yes greater rate. I'm sorry, I'm mixing these both up. They experience sort of greater racial trauma. So again, let me clear this up. Higher levels of vicarious racism, and they also view that others view them in a very positive way in society. They are more likely to endorse levels of racial trauma. This was the exact opposite of what I hypothesized. And then what you see here is that persons with low public regard, this means that they feel like others don't view African Americans as positive in society. They actually feel that others view their group as negative. So in the instance of high vicarious racism, they tend to report high levels of they tend to report lower levels of racial trauma. And so in this instance, we have to unpack and discuss, why is it that African American parents who view or have the views that others in society view them in a positive way, why do they have higher levels of racial trauma when they experience higher levels of vicarious racism? We're going to talk about it. And then we have centrality here, where we see high levels of vicarious racism. And if you're reporting lower levels of racial centrality, meaning that your race is not a central part of who you are, these persons tend to report higher levels of racial trauma. And so one's identity and being an African American is very important in combating racial trauma in the face of experiencing high levels of vicarious racism. And so it means something for your race to be salient, for your race to be a central part of who you are, your identity. That means something here. And so this actually what is a protective mechanism in a way, in terms of centrality, is because your race needs to be central and you need to know who you are when encountering racism and reducing racial trauma. And so let's talk about what we found, the public regard. Why is it that African Americans who view that others view them in a very positive way in society, why do they have higher levels of racial trauma? Well, it's interesting, and we hypothesize a couple of reasons for this. Stereotype pressure. Even positive stereotypes can be harmful because they impose unrealistic expectations and limit individuality. So, when people are reduced to stereotypes, it can feel dehumanizing and create a pressure for Black Americans to conform. It also can be a result of conditional acceptance. When people are valued primarily for a stereotype rather than their full humanity, it reinforces the idea that acceptance is contingent upon fulfilling certain roles. So, this can lead to stress, anxiety, and feelings of inadequacy. And it also can be a result of tokenism. Supposedly, positive views can manifest as microaggressions, such as being told you're one of the good Blacks, or being chosen to represent diversity rather than for your merit. These experiences can be alienating and reinforce feelings of being othered. Other reasons can be an invalidation of one's struggle. Positive stereotypes can be used to dismiss real struggles, such as the model minority myth, which downplays systemic discrimination. And so these are comments that Blacks might have heard, where you're not like the other ones, or you're a different kind of Black, or you're very articulate, or you speak well. Just because out group members might give you sort of these messages, and one's perception can be that Black Americans are valued in this way, it can also be traumatizing as well too, which the findings demonstrate. And also, if a group is perceived as having positive attributes, it may provoke jealousy or resentment, leading to discrimination in other ways, such as workplace exclusion or harsher treatment in legal or social settings. And then also going back to historical and cultural trauma, going back to the model, the Black family stress model. Some positive stereotypes have roots in historical oppression. For example, the stereotype of Black people being physically strong has ties to justifications for enslavement and forced labor. And so I want to emphasize, even if others see these views as complementary, they can still contribute to racial trauma because they reinforce racial essentialism and societal biases, making it difficult for individuals to be seen and valued beyond their racial identity. Now, let's talk a little bit about why, in the presence of high vicarious racism, and then you're perceiving others in society viewing you in a very positive way, that you see these levels, these higher levels of racial trauma. So, high public regard reflects believing that others view one's group positively. However, when experienced vicarious racism, this belief may be shattered, leading to greater distress and higher racial trauma. And so I might think that society views me in a positive way, but for the simple fact that I am still hearing about others in my community, others in my racial group going through racial stressors, the fact that I turn on media, the fact that I'm looking at all these Karen incidents, when coupled with vicarious racism, these views about how others view me might lead to higher levels of stress. So we also speculate that is what also might be happening. And so high public regard individuals are more vulnerable to racial trauma when they experience high levels of vicarious racism. Okay. And also, the impact of vicarious racism on racial trauma really depends on how you think others view you in society. And so, this is very, very important when we talk about preventative interventions, because although one might deny that racism is a thing, because they view others in society that views them, even views them in a positive way, even hearing about other sort of racialized incidents may lead to heightened psychological distress and this sort of heightened physiological response that we tend not to see. And so also when we talk about centrality, low centrality individuals might not have developed the same coping strategies or social support systems related to racial identity, making them more vulnerable when encountering vicarious racism. So individuals with high centrality, they have a stronger group racial identity, and this serves as a buffer against racial stress. So what's the take home point with this, you all? Knowing who you are and having a healthy identity and being Black is important for self identification. It is important to cope in today's society with the varied racial stressors or the different forms of discrimination, of racism that Black Americans have to contend with. But what we do know from today's presentation, and that it is especially important when we talk about vicarious racism. And so, racial identity as a protective shield for Black families. Strong racial identity development is important because when you build positive racial identity and strong group connection, you're creating psychological resiliency. Higher racial centrality, knowing who you are, it being a central part of Black Americans' identity, is a buffer. Family protection. Families with strong racial identity show greater resilience when facing vicarious racism experiences. And also, it results in lower racial trauma and better psychological outcomes when encountering racist incidents in today's society. And so, what are the ways that we can support Black families through racial identity development? Number one, we have to build racial identity, celebrate Black culture and Black history. This is something that we're in this current social-political climate. We're dealing with the removal of programs, but these programs are particularly important for Black Americans. We need to continue to share family stories and traditions. We have to connect with supportive community members, and we must work together and create spaces where we can develop positive self-identification. And that is through built celebrating Black culture and history, through oral tradition, and through storytelling, because this helps us cope with racial trauma by creating safe spaces for discussion. It is practicing collective healing. seeking culturally informed therapy by sort of centering racial identity, and we're building supportive networks. And so, racial identity, when we talk about ways in which we can thrive in today's society and be resilient and help each other and focus on collective healing, racial identity, knowing who we are, should be central to any type of intervention approaches that we do, especially to reduce the stressors on physical and psychological outcomes. And so, let me talk to you all about the other work that Black Families and Racial Justice Project is engaged in. And so, the project that I just presented, the research findings were from Missouri. We're from New York and New Jersey. However, we have conducted a similar study here in Missouri, and it's actually a longitudinal study which gets at ways some of the gaps that I talked about earlier because we're able to look at vicarious racism over time. And so, year one, we successfully recruited 680 families. Year two, we have 540 of those families came back. And year three, we're currently in a data cleaning phase, but we can know definitively across time how vicarious racism impacts parents raising their children and how that impacts their mental health and their physical outcomes. And so we are very, very excited about this. I wanted to share this with you all because that's the work that we've been engaged in Missouri over the past 3 years. And then also, right now, we are recruiting families for in-depth interviews about racial violence and the social injustice in today's socio-political climate. We're also talking about sort of the current administration and what this means for Black families in terms of ways that we have to mobilize and create safe spaces for ourselves so that we can develop sort of culturally responsive programming. And so if you know of anyone, you all, that would like to participate, we want to have conversations with parents with children between the ages of 11 and 14, please share this. And so, again, to learn more about our initiatives, please visit the Buffer Lab. And we would encourage you all to join us in our mission to understand and support Black families through research, education, and community engagement. And thank you all so much. And I am now going to stop sharing and I'll open it up for any questions. Thank you all for attending.
So the first question that was submitted to you,
Okay, I've kind of went over.
oh
Okay,
no, it's all good, uh,
okay.
is in the current polarized political climate, what challenges do you anticipate for research like yours or research that's focused on Black Americans?
So the current political climate, say the first part again.
In the current political climate, what challenges do you anticipate in
Mm.
research like yours?
Well, I think in the current political climate, we do have an administration and we do have organizations that believe that this type of research is divisive. There is, a group of folks who believe that telling these stories somehow will cause more divisiveness. I think we have to remain steadfast and we have to collaborate with organizations and scholars who are committed to do this work, who have always done this work, because I really do believe we're stronger together, but it is going to be challenging. But I think that we have to still be honest. We have to be truth tellers. We have to continue storytelling. And we just can't have a revisionist history about sort of the issues that we have to contend with. But I don't, and I don't know if that's the answer that you wanted to hear, because in this space now, the work that I'm doing, I'm working through this, but I am going to continue to share this knowledge and to engage in this research. So I would encourage whoever asked that question to also link up and collaborate with like-minded people, again, because we're stronger together in doing this work.
The next question I have is, do you suspect that there will be a spike, positive or negative, in cultural pride during this election cycle?
I think that it is a spike in cultural pride. I think that it is causing a sort of movement that, I'm going to give book banning as an example. There are folks who are resisting book banning by sort of collaborating with their community, having library free boxes, going to and sharing books and sharing resources around these sort of banned books. So I think in ways we're getting stronger. I think racial pride is getting stronger. If you are on TikTok, you probably heard of the Hillman Talk University. Black women have came together to sort of educate and disseminate knowledge and information from everything around history to the Gullah Geechee to like law and to understand the Constitution. And so I think it's going to get stronger because this is something that Black folks have dealt with before. And I think that we have to, again, collaborate and rely on each other. So, yeah, I think it's going to increase. I think it's going to be challenges, though, but I think we have to remain steadfast.
Yes. The next question I have is, how do we express and address racism when the English language itself was constructed by individuals who never experienced racism?
And so what was the first part again?
How do we express and address racism when the English language itself was
Mhm.
constructed by individuals who never experienced racism?
And so this is something that I've said that, so for me, I write for Black people. I write for Black families. I write for Black culture. I write for Black children. And so I don't know if they were ever persons outside of Black folks. I don't know if I'm looking to educate them about the work and the scholarship that I do. I always say that slavery is white Americans' history, but how we survived is ours. And so I wouldn't so much focus on ways to educate them because they know they have to have a conversation with themselves and get together the same way that we've always had to. And so I don't know if that's the answer you wanted to hear, but I do think that we have to resist and we have to know who our audience is for. I don't have expectations of persons. They might read my stuff, they may not, but I do write for Black families. I hope that answers your question.
The next question is, doing this type of research can take a mental toll on people. How do you center your inner peace and
Ooh,
find joy?
that's a great question. I take breaks. I take breaks. I meditate. I, spend time with my children, my family, because it's hard. It's hard being a woman of color. It's hard being a Black woman. It's hard doing the scholarship. It's hard reporting these findings. But I am, it's by God's grace that I'm here to do this. And so I never, I don't take that for granted. But at the same time, you have to find spaces of peace in order to do this work. And so I do all of the above. And then I get right back to the work because I know that there's a legacy and there's a story that I want to be able to tell because I stand on the shoulders of a Kenneth B. Clark and a Mamie P. Clark who sort of did the dial test. And that's why I was inspired to be a developmental psychologist. So I just want to light someone else's torch while I'm doing this work. And so that's the way that I sort of um, take a break. I also watch a lot of Netflix too. So I like that. Yeah.
Someone asks, are you familiar with Dr. Colette Chapman Hillard's work?
Hillard, where is that person at? No, I'm not going to ask that, but I am not, but I need to become familiar with it. Say the name again, Colette.
Uh, it is Dr. Colette Chapman Hillard's
Okay,
work. I'll bookmark it.
thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
So that now, the next question I have is, do you have any resources, links, or groups that we could use to help with resiliency?
Yeah, so there are a lot of scholars like myself, Shauna Leith. There are a lot of educators, Gloria Lansing Billings. There's Noel Hurd, there's Fatima Varner, Velma Murray. There are a lot of scholars since the 80s, 90s, Black scholars who have sort of written on ways that Black families can um, so sort of celebrate our strengths and sort of what resilience looks like for us, sort of culturally responsiveness. And so I would say start with looking at the work of social scientists, go to Google Scholar, type up resiliency in African American families, or Black American families, and you'll be able to pull that scholarship up. And I also see a question that I want to respond to very, very quick, just real quick. Can I? Okay, so Joe, I use Black American and African American synonymously. Black American for me just captures that captures the diaspora, and so a person can be like Black American, but they might classify themselves as a Caribbean Black or Afro Canadian, and then African American. I go back and forth, but those persons, it's not necessarily synonymously, but African American are those persons that are descendants of enslaved Africans. So for this presentation, I was going back and forth just because the data was collected in New Jersey and New York, and you have a different group of Black Americans within group Black Americans. So,
Yep, that's all the time we have for these questions. Thank you all for tuning in to this webinar. We hope you have a great rest of your week.
okay, thank you all.
Dr. Barnes, Butler-Barnes.
Thank you.